everyone, and welcome to another episode here on Tales from the Wandering Scribe. I'm your host, Gabriel Garcia, otherwise known as the Wandering Quill, the Wandering Scribe. And welcome to a very special Historians Lounge episode. I am joined with a returning guest making her second appearance on the channel. She is an incredible person, a wonderful historian, and an incredible content creator. If you remember this guest a year ago, we talked about her interest in history, specifically the American colonial period, and how her goal is, among many things, to talk about the American history during the colonial period and bring context to topics that we have often overlooked on some historical eras. And to talk about the American Revolution, and more specifically, a particular battle, the Battle of Bunker Hill, let's give a huge round of applause to returning guest making her second appearance back on the channel, historian and fellow content creator, Lisa Weakland. Lisa, thank you so much for coming back on the channel today.
And thank you so much for having me, Gabriel. I'm excited to be here. I'm excited to talk about Bunker Hill. We're coming up on the anniversary of Bunker Hill, June 17th. So I think it's a really poignant time to talk about it and refresh people's memory on it.
Awesome. So before we dive into the Battle of Bunker Hill, would you like to tell the viewers of what you've been up to since the last time you were on the show a year ago? I know you've been very busy on your YouTube channel as well as posting on your Instagram.
Sure. My Instagram and TikTok, I do short form content over there. I've been doing short form content for almost 5 years. I made the jump to YouTube a little over a year and a half ago. I have a podcast, Historical USA, Road to Revolution. We've been stuck in the colonial era for like the whole year. I mean, I thought it would take me a few months, but it's been a whole year. We're taking a break. I don't know about you, when you're stuck in something so long and you're researching something so long, like a period like this, I like to break it up and kind of focus somewhere else for a minute or two. So right now, while we're in a hiatus, I have a special on American and Israeli foreign policy and what that's looked like since World War I. So it's a 4-part series that I deep dive into a controversial topic that's a very hot button issue that most people don't know a lot of historical context about. So what we're talking about in this series is not necessarily who's right, who's wrong, but as Americans, let's take a look at how we've handled the situation and how each administration since Truman has really kind of tried to make an impact on neutrality, on how they have either tried to stay neutral in the conflict, how they've tried to broker peace in the conflict, or how they have exacerbated the conflict. So that's kind of what we're examining it by, not necessarily, whether Palestine has the right to be there, Israel has the right to be there. That's not the question that my thesis is. The thesis is, how has America handled the situation? That's right. What I want to know. That's what I'm trying to uncover. Because I think whether you are, pro-Israel, pro-Palestinian, and you're an American, I think it's important to understand the historical context here and what we're dealing with. And why things are the way that they are. I think that a lot of people are asking, why can't we just, get this ceasefire done? Why can't we just get things? Well, there's a lot of history here to unpack. There's a lot of points of view that we aren't looking at, that we're totally disregarding when we want an immediate roadmap to peace. So that's kind of, we've taken a little bit of a break. So that's a 4-part series. Second part comes out today. We're covering the 6-Day War in Israel and Yom Kippur. So we're talking about the 1960s, 1970s aspect. And the next one will be more Jimmy Carter to Bill Clinton, and then we'll hit this modern era. Yeah, lots to unpack there. But you know what? I love a good research challenge. And I, like many Americans last October, were very confused on where to stand on the issue. So for me, it was just kind of a hobby that I thought I'd share.
Nice. And if you haven't checked out the episode that Lisa just mentioned or other ones, I urge all of you, my followers and listeners, to go check out Lisa's channel. She's probably made some of the best in-depth historical documentary style content on YouTube. In like the historical realm of like historical content, I would rank Lisa in my top 5. I mean, she is incredible. She does a lot of research. She's very passionate about history and, above all, bringing context to history, because history does need context, because it helps, as I've used the 3 E's: educate, entertain on some aspects of history, and enlighten. And speaking of those 3 E's, as Lisa mentioned earlier in the episode, we're coming up on an anniversary of a special historical event that happened in our own history, the Battle of Bunker Hill. Now, for those that have a broad understanding of American history, and specifically the American Revolution, the Battle of Bunker Hill is probably the most poignant battle in the fight for freedom and liberty from the British Empire by the American colonies. It has been immortalized in artwork, in film, media, so forth. But why? Why is the Battle of Bunker Hill this focal point, this epicenter of, truly, some could argue, this is where the birth of the American Rebellion started? So, Lisa, I'm going to turn over to you. In your research, sort of walk us through the lead up to the Battle of Bunker Hill and why it's so important to talk about it now.
Sure. I mean, I think if you are an American child going to school, when you talk about the American Revolution, you're going to learn a couple of things. You're going to talk about the Boston Massacre, the Boston Tea Party, Bunker Hill, and probably, if you have a good history teacher, Saratoga, obviously the
Yes.
Declaration of Independence, and then Yorktown. And that's kind of it. You know,
Mhm.
and then you'll have civics and they'll talk about the Constitution. But when we're talking about history class, Bunker Hill's kind of right up there with top 5 things that every child in America is going to at least know about. At least know that it happened. Maybe not the nitty-gritty and get into those details, but they're going to know about Bunker Hill, right? Well, when we're talking about Bunker Hill, I mean, history is building blocks, right? You've
Yes.
got to understand historical context, like I said. Now, where do we start off? Well, things have been happening in Boston for well over 10 years at this point. The tensions have been rising. After the French and Indian War, after the Treaty of the 1963, England's lost a lot of money. They want to recoup some of that. If you watched my series on the French and Indian War that we've just finished, England's kind of starting to come around that there is an air of independence in the American colonies. They have a lot more resources. They have a lot more money than England. In fact, what I found really interesting, Benjamin Franklin, around this time in the 1760s, he had written a few letters talking about, at one point, that America, the American continent, North America, after the French and Indian War, the British, they get a huge chunk of France's territory, North America, Canada. So they're now way bigger than the island of tiny little England. And Benjamin Franklin is predicting that North America will be the new seat of government within a few generations of the British, that the crown will be forced to move to North America because that's where the majority of the Brits will be. Well, a couple of elitists in Britain, they don't like that. They kind of start to they kind of start to sense that, you know, the Americans are becoming a teenager. They're becoming unruly. They're not holding to the traditions as they once were. And they're quick to question the mother country on things. And for a long time they had been left alone. They had for over 100 years, created their own governments. They've ruled themselves essentially. Yes, you have royal governors, but their colonial charters were written by them, were changed by them. They have legislatures. They are able to kind of rule themselves in a sense, right? They pay certain taxes, but I mean the taxes aren't a big thing. French and Indian War ends. The Treaty of 1763 comes out. England starts to press its thumb on North America. They start changing certain laws that had been in place. Certain things that the crown had ignored are no longer being ignored, right? So you have the Boston Massacre, which is
Right.
horrible, but you have the Sons of Liberty, and they're ginning things up. And Samuel Adams is such a brilliant political strategist here. He is creating things for the colonists. He's like the Committee of Safety, those come about from Samuel Adams, Joseph Warren, or I'm sorry, James Warren, who's Mercy Otis Warren's husband, Dr. Joseph Warren. These sorts of lines of communication start to be implemented here. Then you have the Boston Tea Party. Now, the Boston Tea Party happens December of 1773. And most people, if you ask, well, what was the response to that? Well, that was they were protesting taxes, but it's a lot more than that. They weren't just protesting the taxes. I mean, let's be honest here. This was a lot more than taxes. This was a proverbial middle finger to Parliament, saying you are not going to boss us around. Now, the East India Trade Company had a lot of benefactors in Parliament, and they were on the verge of going bankrupt. They had all this tea that they could not sell. The Americans were working their way around smuggling in Dutch tea, drinking Dutch tea, not English tea, not tea from the monopoly that the East India Trade Company had. Right. The Brits didn't like that. Okay. They didn't like it at all. So we know about the Boston Tea Party, but it was a whole coordinated effort up and down the colonies. They said when Parliament implemented this tea tax, okay, that you now have to only buy East India Trade Company tea. You cannot buy this tea that people had been smuggling in for decades that we had no problem with for a long time. So Sam Adams, the Committee of Safeties, they go, we are going to turn the tea away. Okay, that was the deal. We're going to turn the tea away. Charleston, they turn the tea away. New York, they turn the tea away. Boston, though, you had Samuel Adams, who was a merchant, who is also prone to smuggling. He did that for a living. Hancock, very wealthy merchant who smuggled tea in for a living, made a lot of money on that. And they said, it's not enough to turn the tea away. We're going to smash up the barrels. We're going to throw them in the harbor. That's what they did. They destroyed the tea. Now, they destroyed probably about $800,000 worth of tea, like in today's money. Okay. A lot of money back then, but the merchant class could cover that cost. And that's what Benjamin Franklin, who was in England, wanted to have happen. Benjamin Franklin himself said, I will cover the cost of the tea. It won't be a big deal. I'll cover the cost. Let's get the merchants to cover the cost. It really would not have been that big of a deal. But oh no, Britain said absolutely not. And they played into Samuel Adams' strategy. They implemented what they called the coercive acts, what we call the intolerable acts.
Yes.
And it was more than just, a slap on the hand shutting down the harbor. Because here's the thing. The colonists were shocked at what the Sons of Liberty did. They were outraged. Okay. They weren't like, yeah, like it was just like a, whoa,
a radical group.
You have taken things too far, right? You have Benjamin Franklin, who's going to Parliament, begging them, let me just pay for it and smooth things over. You have George Washington sending letters to Lord North apologizing personally for what they have done. The Sons of Liberty could have ended right then and there, because the court of public opinion, after they had done that, immediately was outrage. Outrage. What have you done? You've taken it too far. This is no longer, a form of protest. And I could talk about the Sons of Liberty and their terrorist antics for a long time, because that's exactly what they were. They were rabble rousers. But Samuel Adams knew that he won when they got the first coercive acts, because this wasn't just, oh, you're going to pay back the tea. No, this was, we are going to shut down the port of Boston. Okay. We are going to rewrite Massachusetts charter. You will no longer have your own government. Everyone that will now run Massachusetts will be royally appointed by the king or by parliament. Okay, so they got that away. All right, talk about, no taxation without representation. Well, Massachusetts got their whole entire colony, their representation on anything taken away. Right. And they also stopped the meetings. They put a kibosh on any colonial meetings within the colonies. So town meetings, done. You couldn't do it anymore. The British government dropped the hammer on Massachusetts so hard that when the other colonies found out, they were outraged. They were like, well, if they could do that to Massachusetts, they could do that to us. Okay. Then Thomas Hutchinson, Loyalist governor, kind of the proverbial enemy of the Sons of Liberty, he gets recalled back to England. Okay. Parliament wants to know what's been going on with you, Hutchinson. Okay. He's a colonist born in Massachusetts, married into the Oliver family, which was a big Loyalist Massachusetts, family. And he was recalled. He even when he gets recalled, he was working on a history of the Massachusetts colony. Like, he loved his colony, and he gets recalled to England, never to return. But in place, they put Thomas Gage in charge. Okay, Thomas Gage, he is British, but he has married a colonist, a girl from Jersey. He's been living here for years. But they put him in charge. He is a general in the British Army. Okay, so he is now appointed commander of forces in North America, and they supply him thousands, over 5,000 British grenadiers are going to now come into Boston. Okay, and of course they put the Quartering Act. Where are you going to house these 5,000 British grenadiers? Well, they're going to house you in their homes, right? Okay, right. Which is another thing that pisses the colonists off. Okay, which is why we have the Third Amendment that nobody talks about. So
yes,
the quarter, like, so that's why we had that. But so Gage, he comes to Boston and he sees how incredibly volatile it is here. Okay, it is literally a powder keg. And he is tasked to kind of quash this, put a kibosh on this. See,
right.
Lord North is the prime minister in Parliament, and he has taken a very hard stance against America. And there are people that are trying to advocate for the Americans, like William Pitt, that Pittsburgh is named after. He was the previous prime minister, Edmund Burke. There's a lot of people in Parliament that do not agree with what Lord North is doing. But Lord North has his own faction, and he's going to do whatever the freak he wants to do, right? Like, to be honest, when people say, oh, we revolted after 2% tax, it was a lot more than that. Okay, because that 2% tax cost the British more money to collect than it actually made them money.
Definitely. And so, also, just to add into that, what you were talking about in the beginning, so, we're talking about, taxation was like, we've been told growing up that that's like the main reason the U.S. rebelled. No, it wasn't. There's a lot more, as you were just saying, Lisa, there's a lot more context to it. And to add to that, we were talking about at the end of the French Indian War, with the treaty in 1763. Keep in mind, viewers and listeners, England was on the verge of bankruptcy by the time the French Indian War was over. They needed money to recuperate their losses. And when they turned to the American colonies, and correct me if I may be wrong in my statements, Lisa, but they noticed that the American colonies were not being taxed the same as the other English colonies. They were sort of like this dissident, as you were saying, America was becoming a teenager because America realized we were able to do fine on our own. We don't need the English help. Yeah, there are masters, but we can take care of ourselves. Well, British was like, well, not necessarily. You're still subjects of us. You're not totally independent. And the taxes were not necessarily astronomically crazy as the colonists would think. They were literally taxing them the way they would tax any of their other colonies. The thing was, you could argue the Americans at that time, the American colonists felt they were privileged that they were like probably the largest colony of the British Empire because they were almost like you're saying, they were supposed to be the new seat. But as you're talking, Lisa, because what the Sons of Liberties did, that completely shift public perception of the American colonies in the eyes of the British and in the eyes of the other colonies and the other colonial leaders, the future colonial leaders. So one could pretty much argue if the Sons of Liberty pretty much stopped or they did not existed, the idea of an American Revolution probably would not have A, come about, or B, it would have come about, but most likely much later in our own history.
I mean, if Benjamin Franklin had his way early
Yes.
on, we probably would have been akin to Canada. You know, kind
Mm.
of stayed in the Commonwealth, but had our own sovereignty. Now, the other thing too I want to mention is, to that point, the colonies, like I said, Jamestown is established in what, 1607? Okay,
Right.
so that's like a long time from 1617 to or 1607 to 1774, 1775. And they had fought in wars for the crown. Like we had talked about Queen Anne's War, which was the North American theater of the 9 Years' War. We talk about King William's War, which was the War of Austrian Succession. I mean, we had been fighting for the crown in North America as colonists for years and paying for those wars out of their own colonial coffers. But the French and Indian War, the North American theater of the 7 Years' War, which really was a very global event. The second half of that war was really concentrated in North America.
Right.
And it was the first time that the Brits dedicated, they sent 22,000 British troops to defend North America. That was unheard of. They had never, ever, since the settlement of Jamestown, committed that much resources to the American colonies.
Right.
And they didn't need to, because the colonists were perfectly fine with creating their own militias, fighting. You know, if the French were fighting, they were going to fight the French. They were going to fight their native allies on this soil, and they were going to pay for it. Okay. That the French Indian War was really the first time that the Brits paid attention to what was going on in North America and committed serious resources in trying to win the war on North American soil. And they did it at a very heavy cost, like you said. And they wanted to recoup that money. And normally they wouldn't have to have recouped that money because the colonists would have paid for that war. They would have paid for Queen Anne's War just fine. They would have paid for, King William's War like they did. This was really the first time that England was like, whoa, whoa, whoa. We sent tens of thousands of troops. Now you got to pay us back. And really flip the script on how England had operated in North America for the last century with the Treaty of 1763. That's when the colonists went, whoa, are we British citizens? Do we have rights? Because what you're saying, we can no longer operate the way that we've been operating. You've totally turned an eye to how we've been doing things for decades. And now you want to tell us how to live our life? And not only do you want to tell us how to live our life, you demand of us certain things that we had never had to give you before. So that's really where the resentment starts to stem. The Brits changed the script on the colonists, not the colonists changing the script on the Brits.
Ah, okay.
Yeah.
Well, thank you for that clarification. And that kind of leads into what you were saying just before, whereas now the colonists are realizing we are giving up things and being treated as such that we haven't had, as you just said, because now looking at it in a much clearer sense, you're right. The colonists from like the 1600s up into 1760, they have been semi-independent. Yes, they still have to show their loyalty and fealty to the British Empire.
Yeah.
They've been pretty much doing well on their own for almost 100 years, almost 100 years, give or take. It's crazy. And a lot of colonists now who have grown up as like not being totally British. I mean, they are.
Yeah, we are talking about generational, Americans at this point. You have George Washington, whose father comes to the Americas. He was born here. They've made their wealth here. The Adams, same thing. I mean, there are now generations of Americans at this point. And the other thing is, so they implement these coercive acts, right?
Right.
And they had, like I said, they had implemented the stamp tax, or the Townshend Acts, okay, which was a series of taxes that the colonists had to pay, and that Stamp Act, and that was rescinded after protest and rioting and all kinds of things. Well, the coercive acts took that so much further, right? It went, oh, this isn't just a tax. There is no amount of protesting this time that's going to get us to reverse these. Okay, that's really what this was. Now, Thomas Gage, when he gets to Boston, when he sees what's going on, he has to now implement all of these coercive acts, right? He is very leery of the colonial militia. And he is scared that there will be a war, a conflict, right? So one of the commodities that the Americans did not make was gunpowder.
Yes.
All of their gunpowder was imported from Great Britain. And Thomas Gage, when he gets there, he starts hoarding shipments of gunpowder that are coming in to Massachusetts because he does not want the colonists to have their hands on that gunpowder.
Right.
And we're going to talk about an incident called the powder alarm that takes place before Lexington and Concord.
Ooh, okay.
And this is an incident that kind of happens in secret. Gage goes to the Old Stone powder house. So the colonies have powder houses. And if you go to the 13 colonies, some of them are still around. They used to keep their powder in a stone or kind of tabby or a structure that was not made of wood because,
right.
It's very flammable. And you can kind of see these all over the place, especially if you live in New England. They have powder houses all over the place. And this one was called the Stone Powder House that is now in Somerville, Massachusetts. And it's still there. You can go visit it. But the Brits, under the cover of darkness, they sneak away. They go to this. This is happening in February, I believe. So the Boston Tea Party happens December, February, either late February or early March. Thomas Gage, he goes under the cover of darkness. They sneak in when sun comes up because they're not going to take torches in there to try and confiscate. Right. So they go and they confiscate the powder and they take it back to Castle Island, which now is not an island, but back then it was an island. Well, a rumor goes around that the Cambridge militia found out about this, and they confronted Gage and his British grenadiers, and there was a skirmish, and the word goes back that several militiamen have been killed in this little skirmish. Didn't happen. It did not happen, but it was a rumor that it happened. Well, that's all that the militiamen needed was that rumor. 4,000 Minutemen ascend on Cambridge. And all of the patriot leaders are out of town. And it's Dr. Joseph Warren who comes in and he kind of calms the waters, disperses the crowd, but keeps them on guard. Okay, because if this is what they're going to do, they know that this is going to happen again.
Right.
Now, most people don't know anything about Dr. Joseph Warren. In my opinion, as a historian, if he had not died early in the American Revolution, he probably would have been our first president under the United States Constitution.
Really?
Yes, and I am not the only historian who agrees with that, because I will tell you, every event after the powder alarm up until Bunker Hill centers around Dr. Joseph Warren. He is the orchestrator, he is the leader, he is the organizer. It is all on him. Now, who is Dr. Joseph Warren? He was, a lot of historians say he was the right-hand man of Samuel Adams, but I think it was the other way around. Because he was Grand Master of the Freemasons in North America under the Scottish Rite, so he was a very big deal. He was the personal physician of several patriot families. John Adams, he was John Adams' personal physician. He was John Quincy, who the Quincy family was also very big early on, that most people don't talk about, but he was a personal physician to them. Samuel Adams, anyone who was a Freemason knew who Dr. Joseph Warren was. Now, he is a leader of the Sons of Liberty from very early on. Like I said, he was the Grand Master of North America as a Scottish Rite. He, before Bunker Hill, he is the writer of the Suffolk Resolves. Now, most people don't know what the Suffolk Resolves is, but this is when First Continental Congress starts meeting, is right after the incidents at the Boston Tea Party. They start meeting here, especially right as the powder alarm incident happens. And they're trying to figure out what to do, right? Well, Joseph Warren, after this powder alarm incident, he writes the Suffolk Resolves. And I'm going to tell you what they were. And he sends them, after he reads this in the public square, he sends them to Congress, and Congress will unanimously support these articles. Okay, so the Suffolk Resolves, it claims a lot of things. It was kind of a radical document, okay, a lot of the precursor to our Declaration of Independence, but really what it includes is it proclaims the coercive acts to be unconstitutional and void.
Right.
Officials charged with the enforcement of these legal acts will be called on to resign through violent means, if need be, right? Urged Massachusetts to establish their own free government, okay, outside of whatever these royal appointees are, until these coercive acts are repealed. It suggests that future tax collections be retained by the new Massachusetts government and not passed along to the British officials. See,
right.
They didn't have a problem with the taxes, right? Like, they didn't have a problem with that. What they had a problem with was all the imperial tyrannical garbage that the Brits were putting on them. It called for the creation and enforcement of a boycott of British goods and trade with Britain. It advised the people of Massachusetts to appoint militia officers and commence arming their local forces, which is very important. It warned that General Thomas Gage that any efforts to arrest citizens on political charges would result in the detention of that arresting officer. And it announced that subjects no longer owe loyalty to the king who violates their rights. So,
wow,
this is a really, really big deal. And the First Continental Congress will unanimously vote, and there will be a vote on the Suffolk Resolves in the towns. And Paul Revere will carry a copy of this to Continental Congress, and they will support it. Okay, this happens on September 9th, 1774. So, yeah, so Warren is stirring the pot here. He's really pushing, this kind of not liberty yet, but that you have rights, right? Well, 1775, Warren is also tasked with giving the Boston Massacre oration. Okay, so every year since the Boston Massacre, on its anniversary, the citizens of Boston meet, and there is someone that speaks, and they give the Boston Massacre oration. Well, the Boston Massacre oration in 1775 is given by Dr. Joseph Warren. The Old North Church is so crowded that he cannot even get in through the front doors. He has to crawl in through a window to get in so that he can give this oration. And now this is all about, he was an eloquent speaker, but his whole oration is about personal freedom, natural rights, these kind of enlightened ideals, that we'll hear so much more about when Thomas Paine writes his Crisis. But it's really kind of, this is the first time that he starts talking about, we don't have British rights, we have natural rights. Okay, it's not just, we are no longer have rights under the British government. We have natural rights that are God given to us, that we don't need a king to tell us what we can and cannot do. We don't need a parliament to tell us what we can and cannot do. So, Dr. Joseph Warren cannot be understated how important he is. Now, it is Joseph Warren that actually gives the order to Paul Revere and William Dawes to take that midnight ride. It is him. He is the only patriot leader. Okay, when we get into April 1775, Samuel Adams has fled Boston. John Hancock has fled Boston. The only patriot leader in Boston is Dr. Joseph Warren. And when he hears that the British are coming to arrest his two friends and that they are coming to confiscate more weapons, it's him that gives the order to Paul Revere and William
Wow.
to go out and notify Lexington, notify Concord that the British are coming. And we need to tell Sam and John that they need to stay away because they're going to get arrested. It's him that does that, right? And we know that at Lexington, 8 people will die, or at Concord, sorry. But after he gives that order, he will find himself in Lexington when the British get there in Lexington, Dr. Joseph Warren. I don't know when he left Boston, but it seems pretty clear that as soon as he gives the order to Paul Revere and William Dawes, that he skips over the Charles River and heads into Lexington. He is the head of the safety committee of safety. Dr. Joseph Warren is. He will be there when Massachusetts reorganizes their provincial government, and they will vote for him, and he will be president of that government. He will be president over the Massachusetts legislature as a provincial government. And he will stay in Lexington because I don't know if you remember, but after Lexington and Concord, thousands of militia from across the colonies begin to descend on Roxbury and Concord, Roxbury and Cambridge. And it will be Dr. Joseph Warren that will organize those militia. He will be there at the naval battle of Chelsea Bridge, okay, which happens right before. He will be promoted to Major General. And it is him. It is Dr. Joseph Warren that is literally organizing what will be the Battle of Bunker Hill. Okay.
Wow.
So June comes around. Okay, and if you watched my video on Israel Putnam, who is also there, veteran of
Mm-hmm.
the French and Indian War. Um, he had been organizing skirmishes, like hit and attack, kind of, guerrilla fighting against British troops this whole time since April, as they've been trying to get more and more militia around.
Right.
Early June, they hear word that the Brits are planning something. They're planning some kind of attack. They're going to squash this rebellion, which is now what they are calling it. And the colonists begin building earthworks on Bunker Hill. Prescott will start building earthworks on Breed's Hill, which will be the first area of the battle, is Breed's Hill. We talk about Bunker Hill a lot, but Breed's Hill, they also build earthworks and redoubts on Breed's Hill. And the colonists are miraculous in actually getting as much as they were able to get done in a short amount of time. And Thomas Gage, I don't think he was planning on attacking Bunker Hill, but as soon as he saw them, fortifying the hill and bringing more and more colonists around, he really had no choice but to attack. Now, remarkably, we do lose Bunker Hill.
Right.
We lose it, but at a huge cost to the British.
Yes.
Which is very significant because, yes, we do lose it. Okay, you could say it was a lost war, but it proved to the Brits, at least to the officers there, William Howe, Thomas Gage, that these Americans are not messing around. They are not messing around. And remarkably, the colonists will rebuff, they'll repulse 2 British attacks on the hill. The third, they don't rebuff only because they start running out of ammunition. Okay. And it's on that third attack where we hear those famous words, don't shoot until you see the whites of their eyes. Whether it was Prescott that said it, whether it was Putnam that said it, the reason why it was said was because they were running low on ammunition and they could not afford to shoot until they got closer and had those sure, that sure shot. So, remarkably, I mean, the Brits will lose about 3,000 people and we'll lose about 2,400. Now, Joseph Warren will also die at Bunker Hill, and the circumstances of his death are still debated on. But it is pretty clear that he dies in the third, after the third assault, when they do start hand-to-hand fighting. He will be shot point blank in the face. Now, there's a few legends around there, but I like to think just from how much of a rebel rouser he was and how involved in the Sons of Liberty and how high up of a leader he was in the rebel movement, I think he was probably murdered. Because what we know is the colonists were in retreat when he was shot. And he was shot point blank in the face. Now, there is an account that he was sought out by a British officer that had dealings with him in Boston beforehand. And like I said, the Sons of Liberty, I mean, they were not peaceful protesters a lot of the time. They got into a lot of fights. There was a lot of rioting. I mean, heck, they destroyed the governor's mansion in Massachusetts.
Yes.
And that work that I was talking about, Thomas Hutchinson was writing, they took it and burned it, and so the Sons of Liberty weren't, your peaceful protesters or anything like that. The British hated those guys.
Yes.
They hated them. And I think that a colonial officer or a British officer saw Joseph Warren in the crowd, shot him point blank in the face, killed him. And there are some witness accounts that they believe that's what happened. Now, people don't know what happens to Joseph Warren. A lot of people thought he got out, he escaped. Months later, Paul Revere will go with Warren's brother to Bunker Hill, where the Brits had haphazardly thrown everyone in a mass grave, and will uncover a body that had been stabbed over and over again with the bayonet.
Oh, jeez.
And a shot to the face, and Paul Revere will identify Joseph Warren from a metal dental implant that Paul Revere had put in Joseph Warren years before. That's how they identify Joseph Warren's body. And whatever, what if, that's a big what if for me in history, if he didn't die there, what his impact on America would have been. But yeah, man, that's what you get with Bunker Hill. We lost a great patriot leader, but we made our mark in American history that hey, we're here to fight, and we're not just gonna give up our rights.
Definitely. And from what you've said, Lisa, you've painted I think a full history of the United States when we look at the colonists and everything, because you talked about that these are generational people that have grown up on the frontier. They're used to fighting and fending off the native or indigenous people in Albany, New York, and what is considered by the British Indian Territory, because the British did make a proclamation that the colonists cannot move beyond the proclamation line
which, by the way, the Brits had the British government had no way of enforcing proclamation 17 the proclamation of 1763. They had no way of enforcing it. And you know who owned a lot of land across the Appalachian Mountains? George Washington.
Yes.
So he wasn't going to follow it either. I mean, you have to understand that by 1763, there is already I don't want to call it an aristocratic class, but there is an elitist class in the colonies that a lot of our founding fathers were a part of, and they had and there is some truth to that. They had a lot of money in North America that the British didn't have, and for them it was a lot more than just freedom. It was freedom of business, freedom of commerce, freedom of, it was more of a socioeconomic freedom that they wanted.
Definitely. And it is really interesting, as you mentioned, this history that I did not know about, American history. And I'll be the first to say that I know probably very little in terms of the lesser known pieces of American history, especially leading up to the American Revolution. Dr. Joseph Warren, I knew nothing about until this episode, but it does paint a very interesting picture, like a big what if. If Dr. Joseph Warren did not die at the Battle of Bunker Hill, it would have been interesting to see how different the United States would have been politically, militarily, and socially with its neighbors. And also, I remember from our previous episode, your historian's interview, I remember we talked about another possible what if at the time of the French Indian War, where George Washington served in the British Army, because a lot of colonial leaders did serve in the British Army to gain experience. If he had not been denied a commission in the British forces, quite possibly the idea of an American place, or not American place, but the idea of America being its own independent nation would have been drastically altered. But those are the things about historical what ifs. They allow us to really examine, okay, what events lead up to this discussion? What are sort of the intertwining events in history? And that's probably the beautiful thing about history, is that those little nuances, what we can explore and uncover and bring context to. Because what have we learned in this discussion? The Americas are pretty much a fighting force on their own. They've been fighting since the 1600s. They're used to fighting against the European powers and the native allies. They've grown accustomed to being on their own and developing their own sense of identity. We talked about generational heritage, making their own government, their own language, which is drastically different from English in Britain, which I think that not a lot of people really take in consideration. The colonists at this time, they wouldn't sound like your typical resident from Great Britain unless they moved from Great Britain to the colonies. Their language would have been vastly different and regionally different if they were New England, Boston, Philadelphia, deep South, it would have been vastly different. And ultimately, as Lisa said, the Sons of Liberty were not the protesters or the peaceful protesters that we have immortalized them in history books. They were radicals. They were violent protesters. I mean, we haven't even talked about at the time with the powder keg in Massachusetts how the colonists tarred and feathered people for doing their job. It was horrendous what was
No,
happening.
they didn't. They tarred and like if you were a loyalist and you lived in a patriot town, you lived in a rebel town, you were ran out. You were ran out of your town if you were a loyalist. The loyalists weren't doing that to people who had patriot sympathies, who
No.
were independent in a way. In fact, the early ideas of the revolution are ones that I'm really interested in talking about because I think you can see um, from James Otis Jr., who I think is probably the founder of the founders, that most people have no idea who he is. He gets taken out of the game. He becomes insane. He gets a traumatic brain injury during one of these
Ooh.
riots, and he never recovers from it in 1769, and he kind of gets pushed out of the fray. But those ideas, what I call Whig ideas, these
Mm.
um, those are pushed by James Otis Jr. and will influence John Adams, who serves with him as a young law student. Um, John Adams, Sam Adams, uh, those kind of things. But you'll see the ideas change from are we British citizens? Do we have British rights? To no, we have natural rights. We don't need you. Because the early ideas are just we just want to be represented equally. We just
Right.
want the same rights that we would get if we lived in England.
Hmm.
And it turns very quickly in a short amount of time with radicals like Dr. Joseph Warren that no, this is more than just British rights. These are natural rights. Those ideas of the Enlightenment start coming in. And
Mm.
I'm really interested because so right now my podcast we have ended with the French and Indian War.
Right.
And this next year, which starts July 4th, this next season of the podcast will be exploring okay, who are the major players in this? Like John Dickinson, like Joseph James Otis Jr., like a Thomas Hutchinson and a Peter Oliver, who actually writes in his journal about Dr. Joseph Warren being murdered because he hated Dr. Joseph Warren. He was a loyalist. Who are the major players here? Who's really running this gambit? Because I think I like to do a lot of genealogy. I have family members that lived in this time period that fought in the
Mm.
Revolutionary War, or didn't fight in the Revolutionary War, and they were just regular farmers, just caught up in this. So who's really pushing these things? Who's really pushing these ideas? Like I'm really interested in talking about that. Where does this start and how does it evolve into a Declaration of Independence within about 15 years?
Definitely. So this leads into the last few discussions which I have for you, Lisa, and I want your honest opinion. So on
Sure.
your researching the timeline of the American Revolution, and from what you've told me, in your opinion, based on your research, do you believe that the American identity was forged with, we always associate George Washington being like the founder of like the United States government, or in your opinion, do you believe the American identity, the concept what it is to be American, began with Joseph Warren and was immortalized at the Battle of Bunker Hill and then fine-tuned by the other patriot leaders, George Washington, Thomas Jefferson, Benjamin Franklin, Nathaniel Greene, and so forth?
In a sense, I like I said, I think there are people who are different. So, for instance, John Dickinson's Letters of a Farmer. I think that's the first time you see a viral His pamphlet goes viral amongst the colonies, not just in
Mm,
Pennsylvania where he is, but it gets published over and over again as a series of letters in colonial newspapers, and it is it lights a fire for revolution. John Dickinson was able to clearly explain in layman's terms at that time what was really transpiring here with the Stamp
mm.
Act, what was really transpiring here with the Townsend Acts, what this meant, and what we should do about it. Now, John Dickinson, he signs the American Constitution, but he does not sign the Declaration of Independence. He is the writer of the Olive Branch Petition.
Ah, okay.
I don't think that huge fire of independence really comes around until Thomas Paine. And
Mm, okay.
he begins writing, the crisis and his propagandist work. And Thomas Paine doesn't come here till 1774. And I
Right.
think he really lights a fire, an inferno of independence. Now, Bunker Hill, um, I think that you have people who still want reconciliation with Great Britain. Even after Bunker Hill, they feel like there is a path forward. That now that Parliament's heard our voice, the government will listen to what their redresses really were, whether it was through violent means or not. And it just had the opposite effect. It just had the opposite effect and pushed more people to the radical side.
Hmm. And honestly, with this discussion of history, which it is important to talk about history because it fills in the gaps, it provides content, and allows us to learn. So I guess like the good tie into this amazing and very thought-provoking discussion, Lisa. In your opinion, what do you think people should take away from the Battle of Bunker Hill? And in your opinion, where does it stand? I hate saying that, putting like in a hierarchy in like the major moments of the American Revolution, but in your opinion, where does the Battle of Bunker Hill rank itself among the titular moments in the American Revolution? I mean, we know it is important, but would you say it is as important as the major battles later on in the fight for independence against Great Britain?
Yeah, I think it's an immortal moment. I think that there are certain moments in history that define a generation. I think Bunker Hill is one of those that defines our founding generation. Um, I think you could say the same thing about D-Day that we just celebrated. It defined a
Mm-hmm.
generation. I was talking to my grandmother actually about that, and she said, "Well, I was 10 years old, and she remembers that on the day of the operation in school that they talked about it in school, and she knew it was a big deal even then." And I think that, and here's the other thing too, Bunker Hill was witnessed by a lot of people. Okay, not only were they fighting, but young John Quincy Adams was watching it across the river from Braintree. Thousands of people were witnessing what was happening at Bunker Hill. Thousands of colonists were watching these militiamen, these Minutemen take a stand. And it was very inspirational. It was very dramatic. John Quincy, he was 7 years old and wrote about it in his diary, his little 7-year-old diary, and he remembers it. So this is a moment in American history that a lot of people witnessed. It was very dramatic, and
Yeah,
and like I said, it defined a generation, and I truly believe that.
definitely. And also to quote the movie Patriot with Mel Gibson, where he's talking with the South Carolina delegation in Congress, he said, and I quote, it's probably the most poignant line, one of his most poignant lines in the movie: "The battles that will come will not be fought on a distant battlefield. They'll be fought in our homes, in our neighborhoods, and the innocence of our children will be lost." Because I'm sure you would definitely agree, Lisa, the children who grew up hearing about that battle, who witnessed everything at a young age, as you said, would have that memory imprinted on them for the rest of their life. Because as you said, it defined a generation. That is a moment that they will never, ever forget. And the rank of moments of history that will never be forgotten by the youth of that generation, of their respective generations, Bunker Hill is definitely that. And also, just to add one last thing, we talked about a lot of the major leaders, or mentioned them: Thomas Paine, Dr. Joseph Warren, Samuel Adams, so forth, George Washington, and many others. One thing I also found interesting, just to add on to this before we end, a lot of these leaders, these artworks that depict them as like very old wise men, they were not that old. They were actually pretty young. Like some estimates, and quote me if I'm wrong, were in like their 20s and their 30s. They're like pretty young adults. They're not like old men, at least not some of them. So these were young adults, young men who came together and decided, we're going to fight against the most powerful empire in the Western world in the 18th century. And by some miracle, by sheer luck and home advantage, because there's a whole discussion, another video about home advantage for the colonists, they
Sure.
somehow won. And honestly, with everything Lisa said, the Battle of Bunker Hill and many other battles and moments in history should be remembered, should be honored, and should be given the proper historical research that it deserves. And this will end this amazing and very thought-provoking discussion here on the channel. And I want to give a huge thank you to Lisa for coming back on the show and giving us a deep dive into the road to Bunker Hill, the major players, the events that a lot of people like myself did not know about. So Lisa, thank you so much for that. Thank you for coming on the show. And I know you mentioned that you have some episodes lined up, but do you have any future projects down the road that we should be looking out for?
I do actually. I am about to start a book club.
Ooh.
So I'm working on that. It'll probably be through my Patreon, although the book club itself, like the book each month, will be free. Um, I am, like I said, season 2 of my podcast comes out July 4th, and then I am also in a bit of a rebrand mode. So a new website with some merch will be coming out as well.
Ooh,
So
nice.
get yourself some merchandise, some historical merch, some American history merch is in the works. So yeah,
Awesome.
lots of big things going on for sure. For sure. But
Definitely.
thank you so much for having me. This was so much fun. Anytime I could talk history is like my favorite. So
Same here. Same here. And also, before I forget, where can people find you on social media to be caught up with all your posts as well?
yeah, I am everywhere. Instagram at historical_USA. TikTok, same thing, historical_USA. I am on Spotify, Apple Podcast. I'm on rumble.com. I'm on YouTube. I'm even on Twitch. I've actually started playing
Ooh,
Assassin's Creed Black Flag.
yes.
So, because, golden age of piracy, I've done a few
Mm-hmm.
episodes on those guys. So I thought it would be fun to watch that. So I'm on Twitch. I will be playing that, and then I'll be playing Assassin's Creed 3, which is, of course, the American Revolution. Although I think I might I think I might play Liberation in between that. So I'm on the Assassin's Creed franchise. If you want to go over there and watch me play, that's on Twitch. I try to get on about every Saturday morning, play a few hours. So
Nice.
yeah, I'm kind of all over the place.
I hope you do get a chance to play Rogue, because that's the only Assassin's Creed battle or Assassin's Creed series that delves into the French and Indian War. I know 3
Rogue,
does
that's right.
that, but
Yeah.
Rogue mainly focuses on that. Well, I can't wait to see that. And also, my viewers and listeners, if you want to watch my first interview with Lisa, I'll make sure to tag it right here. I'm going to move out of the way because that's where the video is going to be. Make sure to give that a watch and give that a like. And thank you all so much for joining us for another very special episode of the Historians Lounge series. Again, a huge thank you to Lisa for coming back on the show, making her second appearance. And who knows, I may have her again for a third appearance on another topic in history, or maybe something else. You never know, but definitely stay up to date with the episodes on my lineup as well as the episodes for Lisa and her channel. And until next time, make sure to like and subscribe and comment down below what was your favorite part of the interview and what did you find most interesting about the Battle of Bunker Hill and the road leading up to it. Until next time, this has been the Wandering Scribe and the Wandering Quill signing out, wishing you all a wonderful day.